Welcome to the kingdom. I'm Chris, and this is Good Enough Gaming. So today we're going to be painting some Custodes Dreadnaughts. As you can see, I've already got the model primed, and when you're priming Custodians, things can get a little tricky there. The GW base spray paint for Retributor Armour, it's really good, but it's unbelievably expensive. So if you're okay with shelling out 30 bucks for a can of paint, I mean, go ahead and do so. The alternative is to spray it with some kind of a khaki color, like Xandri dust or some other color like that, and then you can either airbrush or brush paint Retributor Armour from the pot over top, and you'll get the same kind of base coat. After you get that down, as you can see in here, I'm using Reikland Fleshshade. That's just my preference, but you can use pretty much any brown or reddish tinted wash. Agrax Earthshade will give the gold kind of a dirty, worn out, grungy look. You can also use a sepia like Seraphim Sepia, and that will give it kind of a honey colored look to it, whereas I like to use the Fleshshade here. It does give it a bit of a reddish tinge, but when we come back in and do the dry brushing with the lighter gold color, you'll see it comes out really nice. I'm going to speed up the camera here in case you didn't notice, because I'm actually painting two of these models at the same time. So I work on one, then put it aside and let it dry while I paint the other one there. So I've got one holding the giant spear and then one with the sword and shield. And rather than make you watch me paint each of them the long way, I'll do one of them in regular speed so you can see it, and then when I do the second one, I'll speed it up about 3 times the speed. So that's what's going on if you notice that the speed of the video is bouncing back and forth. Believe it or not, I think painting Custodes is actually a very easy paint job. As you'll see here, most of the hard work is just in getting that nice golden color on the armor and then adding some details here and there. But if you're new to painting and you want an army that looks really nice but isn't super difficult to paint, you could do worse than to use Custodians. Like all Space Marine models, the fact that they have a single color for most of their armor makes them ideal as a kind of a starter army to paint with, and that's part of the reason GW uses them as their flagship. You have other armies like the Necron, who also are pretty monochromatic and you just have to paint some details. Whereas when you move on to other armies like Orcs or especially Eldar, you've got lots of details, lots of different colors. These guys, however, as you'll see, very easy. I got both of these painted in just a couple hours. And once you get down this pattern of base prime, wash, and then a couple layers of highlight, you can paint pretty much any kind of armor, whether it be medieval armor, science fiction, anything like this. The principle holds true no matter what when you're painting armor. So now that the wash is dried, we can move on to the first level of highlight. For this one I'm using Auric gold. I want a nice bright, nice yellow gold to kind of bring back some of that golden look to it. The Retributor armor already has a red tinge, and then the Fleshshade wash has a further red tinge, and as you can see on the model there, it's starting to look not quite bronze, but it's a fairly dark red. So what we're going to do now is a fairly heavy dry brush over the whole thing, especially big broad areas like the top of the armor. You don't have to worry about the shoulder pads because we're going to paint over those, but this is almost going to be your basic color. The whole point of the initial priming and washing was to shade the recesses and the darker areas, but the actual golden color for the armor is coming from this highlight, and then the accent highlight we're going to do after is what's really going to make it pop. So while I'm finishing up this first layer of dry brushing, I wanted to mention that when I talk to people and they ask me to paint their models for them, or they ask me about painting, the reason they don't like it is they say it takes too long and they get bored. They get kind of dissatisfied. They don't see the results as quick as they like. One way I find to help combat that is find something to do while you're painting. Find a good book to listen to, find a good show to watch, and soon the painting is what you're just kind of doing to keep your hands busy while you're enjoying the show. I've actually found that only 50% of my enjoyment from painting is from the model itself. If I have a show or something that I'm really enjoying watching, I'll look forward to painting because it gives me a chance to enjoy the show as well. Painting takes time and there's no way around that, so find something else to do that you can enjoy while you're painting. So here you can see a comparison. The one on the left is clearly brighter, the one on the right still hasn't been dry brushed, but you're starting to see the gold start to re-emerge while we're not losing that nice shade from the initial wash. And now we rinse and repeat on the second model. With the gold dry brush out of the way, we now do the very last level of dry brushing, and for this one I like to use Runefang steel. Be pretty sparing, you just want to hit the sharpest edges, don't try and cover the whole thing. Get sharp edges, corners, and maybe some of the detailing on the leg panels to stand out just a little bit. This will give it a little bit more of a sharp metallic look. It'll bring out the contrast between the lightest and darkest areas, but if you put it on too much, you'll start to blend the silver and the gold together and it might look a little bit messy. So it's always better to brush lightly and add more, because if you have too much, you can't take it off. I don't know who invented or discovered dry brushing, but they, I think, have guaranteed their spot in the afterlife. It is a nice, simple technique. It covers a multitude of painting sins, and it's probably one of the first skills that every painter learns when they start painting miniatures. It might not come out as clean or as precise as layering everything by hand, but this is good enough painting. We're looking for a nice looking paint job that's not going to take 6 hours just to paint one helmet. Now, as Duncan would say, with that, the armor is complete. So now we need to start moving on to picking out some of the details, starting with the cabling, the piping, and the joints of the armor. Now for this, I'm deciding to use Vallejo black. You can also use Abaddon black or Abaddon black for our folks across the pond. I prefer the Vallejo. I find it has more of a matte finish. It's not quite as shiny. I also find it goes on a little bit nicer. The Abaddon seems to be a bit thin, and I usually have to put on 2 or 3 coats to get it to cover, especially something as shiny and bright as gold. But the Vallejo, 1, maybe 2 coats, and it gets the job done. Now, the one problem you can run into doing batch painting or painting multiple models at the same time, and you'll see me do this here, is I move on to one without painting everything that I'd planned to on the other. So throughout the rest of the video, you'll see that some of the joints get missed, some other areas I meant to cover I don't cover. Eventually I catch them. But as long as you know what color you wanted and eventually you get to it, at this point the order doesn't really matter. As long as you don't really mess up and your arm jerks and you smear black all over the armor, you're not going to have to do anything else. You can always go back. So after covering the pipes, the cables, the arm and limb joints, and also the weapons in black, that's pretty much everything we're going to need that for. So while we're waiting for the black to dry on the weapons, we now get to what I think is the best part. It's like painting flesh on infantry models. It just seems that when you add this one super bright color in the right place, it takes the model from looking like a statue to actually looking like something else. So we're going to use Mephiston red to color the shoulder pads here. Don't worry about covering up the details and those spirals of gold on the shoulder pad. We're just going to paint over those. It's a raised surface. It's much easier to attach over than try and paint the red all around it. That's not going to work. You'll definitely need 2 coats for this, even though Mephiston red is a nice solid base paint with a good pigment. It's still not as thin or as thick as it needs to be to cover up that really bright gold. Also notice on this pad, rather than try and be real precise and paint around it, I go slow to make sure I get the deep crevices and the corners that might be hiding. But after that, I'm not too concerned if I accidentally paint red all over that the laurel wreath there and the banner. The important thing is to get the red color on. Later on we'll come back and we'll add the gold back in that tiny area. The gold can layer over the red without any problem at all. You can see an example here of what happens when your paint's a little bit too thin. It starts to bead and pull and separate, so I had to get a little bit more paint, a little less water, and then it goes on nicely. So I think once we've got the shoulder pads and the shield done, these are starting to look like Custodes. Now in a couple seconds, when the film transitions to the next element of it, you're going to notice a big change in the background. Here it comes. 3, 2, 1. I decided it was time to clean that mat. There was so much dried paint on it, it was actually reflecting the light back and possibly ruining some of the film quality. So there was about a 2-hour pause between painting the first coat of the red and the second one, because I took the mat inside and some elbow grease, a magic eraser from Mr. Clean, and a whole lot of water, and I finally managed to get all that paint off. So there's the grid of my cutting mat. Look at that, it's still there. And a bit later in the video, you'll see another surprise. What could it be? Stay tuned. In the meantime, we got to put our first layer of wash on this red to tone it down a little bit to get the effect we're going to be looking for later. So using Carroburg Crimson on the shoulder pads, It darkens it while still maintaining a nice deep bold red color. You could use black Nuln Oil, you could use Agrax Earthshade if you want it to be that grungy look to it, but I'm sticking with the red. Once you got that on, we're going to start dry brushing. First with the initial color, going back to Mephiston Red, and you want to get most of the shoulder pad, but not the whole thing. Leave an area close to where the red touches the gold. This will give it that kind of three-dimensional look because you'll have some shadow between the gold and the red. And once we finish dry brushing on the Mephiston Red, we'll go one color higher. I believe that was Evil Sun Scarlet, and we'll dry brush again, but this time a little bit more focused on the center and the edge to get a nice gradual gradient from the dark red right up beside the gold to something much brighter. And while I'm waiting for the dry brush to dry on one model, I can work on the other one. Now, unfortunately, when I started dry brushing the shield, I wasn't paying attention. I was holding the model outside of view of the camera, so most of the dry brushing of the shield I'm unable to show you, and that's my bad. I apologize. But near the end, you'll still see how it looks. The raised edges catch the highlight really nice, and the shield comes out looking really good. At this point, with both layers of dry brushing finished, it's time to start re-picking out that golden detail. You could do silver if you wanted. You could. I choose to do gold. It all depends on what you want the final aesthetic to be. But get a nice steady brush. Use the side of it. I actually found in this case I had a brush, a synthetic brush that curves at the tip. Anyone who's used synthetic brushes always gets that curve. That actually was perfect because it allowed me to paint from the tip but from the side at the same time. And so I was able to get really, really good control, highlighting that really tiny golden script and scroll work there on the shoulder pad. It worked out really well. You can also see here how easily the Retributor armor covers up the red that I painted over the wreath and the scroll work. If you'd like, you can always give it the same treatment as the armor, paint the gold, put the Fleshshade wash, dry brush. You got to be a little careful with the dry brushing that you don't go over on the red. So instead, I just painted the gold over it and did a very, very light wash to increase the shade and give it a little bit of depth. But I don't think you need to go back and do the whole 9 yards of dry brushing on it. So the key to this part, like any other part in painting, take your time, go slowly, get it right the first time. If you do make a mistake, as you see I do right there, it's not that big of a deal. Once I'm finished, I go back with the darkest red that's closest in color to where it is in that part of the shoulder pad and just paint over it and everything looks fine. If you try and rush too much, you're going to make more mistakes and you'll get frustrated and you'll end up quitting, and nobody wants that. The time to take a break and put down your brush and go do something else is when you start feeling like you're working rather than you're enjoying a hobby. You can see there, another mistake, quick touch up, and we're right back on track. With the gold trim finished on the one model, we'll go back to the other, and now just to give the shoulders a little extra something, we're going to paint them with the technical Ardcoat. It makes them a bit shiny. It gives that look that they're maybe a slightly jeweled or glass or something, but it just sets it apart. I mean, the armor itself is all shiny and gold, and so if you want to make the shoulder pads stick out even more, you got to give them a different kind of a sheen or a shine to them. So I found that this made it look nice. This made it look different. On a model with a very matte armor, you put something gold or silver on it to stick out. Well, on a model that's entirely shiny armor, you got to find something else. So on both shoulder pads, and then also on the shield, a thin down coat a little bit. If you put on the Ardcoat too thick, you'll actually see brush marks when it dries. And from a distance you won't notice it, but when you pick it up and take a look at it, you will. And it's really hard to try and fix any mistakes that you make when putting on Ardcoat, especially once it dries. With the Ardcoat on, the red areas are done. And while we're waiting for it to dry, or after it's dried, we'll now turn to some of the really micro details here on the rest of the body. So there are these gems in the few strategic places throughout the model. There's not many of them, but I chose to paint him a blue. Give him a nice stark contrast. There's plenty of yellow, there's plenty of red. So on these jewels, do something like a blue or a green, just something to really set them apart. So I started with a Kantor blue to give it a nice dark base, and then literally a tiny dot of some lighter blue. I think I ended up using Calidor Sky, but all you need is a dark blue and a light blue. Cover the gem in the dark blue, little dot on the tip of the light blue, and you're done. A bit earlier that I neglected to film, I also painted the eyes. I used Averaland Sunset. Now the yellow does blend in quite a bit with the gold, but it was what the cover box art used, so I stuck with that. And then you also go in with some either Fuegan Orange or with Cassandora Yellow, just to give some shadow around the eyes. Now I don't know if you just caught it there, but there was the second big change to the camera. I found that my video camera was on a setting that was meant to really enhance colors, and as a result the gold was almost blinding. So I turned it off, and now it's a lot more muted. So I'm curious what the preference is from you as the viewers. If you thought the previous gold was a lot better and shinier, or whether you like this slightly subdued version, please let me know, because I can change the camera back. I always like bold colors, but with the gold and all the lights on it, it was a little bit too much. Okay, so now we're going to the weapons. The torsos, or rather the bodies of the Dreadnaughts are finished. We're not going to touch them anymore. It's now onto the weapons. So first we want to highlight the edges of the weapons. I have a standard highlight pattern that I use to get a nice clean looking black. So base coat with either Abaddon black or Vallejo black or some other black, and then when you highlight, I like to use Eshin gray as my first edge highlight, followed by Dawnstone. I find that it's a really nice combination. It makes the black stick out without turning the whole piece that you're painting to look gray or something too light that you're not looking for. So go over all of the edges, highlight the entire edge pieces and surroundings of the weapon in Eshin gray, and then go back and just do the sharpest edges and the edges that are facing upwards and would catch the light. Do those in the Dawnstone, and that's when you'll get a really nice clean black look. I use this same color scheme of black on the weapons, on the cables, on the joints, any black on this model is going to have the Eshin and Dawnstone combination. You can mix it up a little bit. For example, if you use like a dirtier gray like Skaven Blight Dinge, it might give it somewhat more of a grungy look. If you want to give it a blue steel look, use something like Incubi Darkness or Stegodon Scale Green as your first layer, and then after that use Thunderhawk Blue, and it will give the blue steel effect to it. But with this one, I wanted to stick with a gray. I know that some contrast can look nice, and with the yellow and the red from the model, blue steel might have stuck out, but I instead decided to play it safe and go with the neutral gray. As you can see here, when I start to put on the Dawnstone, you don't highlight everything that you highlighted with the Eshin. Then your model ends up looking like something from a Tron video, which, I mean, if that's what you're going for, have at. But instead, get sharpest edges and edges that are going to be directly reflecting light. And it gives your model not just a highlight in a sense of depth, but it gives it that realism because the areas that are in light are going to be highlighted and the areas that are in shadow won't. Now we're on to the final bit with the blade. I wanted to give it kind of an energy blade look, a dark blue fading up to a nice brighter blue as you got closer to the tip. So I started off using Kantor blue, a nice dark navy blue there. But I puzzled and actually painted half of the sword blade before deciding that I wasn't liking the blues that I was going with. The first set of 3 blues, the dark, medium, and light, they were lighter, but they were also getting paler, and the blade was starting to look pastel, almost like it was weakening as it got closer to the tip rather than, more intensely burning with energy. So, as a great example of whenever you make a mistake, you can always just paint over it, and as long as you've been using thin paints up to any point, as long as it's only 1 or 2 coats over top, you're not going to notice anything. Now, if you start painting 50, 60 layers over it, yeah, that's going to gum up a little bit. Each blade did need 2 coats just to make sure the black got fully covered and we got a nice solid blue foundation to work with. So here you can see the result of me changing my mind. Initially I'd started highlighting the blade with a Liatok blue and then moving on to a Hoeth blue, but as I said, that got very pale rather than bright. So I went back over, and the first highlight I used on the blade was Teclis blue. It's a very bold blue, and it still maintains kind of the vibrant look that I was looking for. The final highlight that I'll do a bit later is using Temple Guard blue, and that's a pretty strong blue. You're getting very light, but it's not a sky blue. It still has a little hint of green to it. It's a much bolder color, and I think it works out better for a power sword or an energy sword. But all I had to do when I decided that I wanted to change the colors was just wait till the previous one dried completely and then paint it right over top of it. Now, when I was painting on these lighter highlights, I usually did 2 or 3 coats, and each coat move a bit further up the blade. Not much, like maybe the width of your brush tip, or about halfway down the brush bristles. And these layer brushes, because of the way they dry, that will actually give you a nice natural blend into the lighter colors. Obviously, if you're an expert at something like wet blending, you can get a really beautiful blend, but we're not going for perfect here. We're going for good enough. So now I'm adding that Temple Guard blue. You can see it's a very bright color, and my initial reaction was, oh, that's a little bit too bright. But once it dries, as long as you put it on thin enough, it'll dry a little bit darker, it'll blend in a little with the color beneath it, it'll look fine. Just trust it. With the blue finished, we now just add a little bit of white scar to the very, very tip. In fact, even the amount I put here is coming dangerously close to too much. You put a little bit at the raised edges of the tip and the inner blade of the sword there, just to show that the energy is kind of reaching a fever pitch at the point, and it's about ready to burst out of the sword itself. So a little bit of a V on the sword tip, and then paint the edge of the sword, the entire edge of the sword, to give that really sharp contrast between the white and the dark blue, and it'll pull everything together. Make sure you use the side of your brush. Makes it very easy to paint sharp edges like the sword here. I had a little bit too much paint on mine when I did it, and watch, when I turn it, you can see this blob that popped up on the side. Now that's easily fixed. You can either try and get some water and just catch the paint before it dries and brush it out, or wait until it dries and go back with the darker blue over top of the edge. I think I went with the latter. I just painted over it with blue. Working on the other blade here, we are so close to being finished. The only thing we have left is a few minor details on the very tip of the spear blade and the sword, and we will be done. Just like we did with the shoulder pads, we need to come in here and repaint that gold detail on the scroll work on the inside of the blade. So same thing, get a very tiny brush, make sure the paint is fairly well watered down, although with metallics that can be a little tricky. Just make sure that the bristles are nice and wet so the paint flows off freely, and take your time and make sure you get only where you need to. If you do get a little bit of gold on the blade itself, touch it up after it dries. Alright, so we're on to the last details here. We got this little eagle head we got to paint. There's a marking on either side of the spear that we want to paint right next to the eagle head. And then we got to pick out the barrel of the las cannon. We're going to use lead belcher for that. And once that's done, the model's finished and all that's left is basing. I was all excited to be finished and then realized I forgot to paint the flamethrower nozzles. So for these ones I used Balthazar Gold. Runelord Brass will work just as well. A couple coats of each one. When that's dry, throw a layer of Agrax Earthshade on top to shade it a little bit, and they'll look great. And there they are, all finished. You're not going to win a golden demon with it, but it's good enough.